Welcome to my guided tutorial on reading Part B of the OET. And we're going to start with some tips and tricks or general advice before moving into some practice questions together. So here's my first couple pieces of advice. First is to read the question carefully. I know it sounds obvious, but a lot of our question difficulty actually comes in the exact verb that's being chosen. So for example, you'll commonly see verbs like warn, remind, and emphasize. Those sort of verbs tell us exactly what we should be looking for in the text itself. Second is you want to try to eliminate options as you read. Now for some questions this will be easier than others. Sometimes you are clearly given evidence in the text that one option is clearly wrong, and I call this the negative evidence. So not only are you searching for evidence to support the answer, we're also looking for evidence that can rule out other options, and that sometimes makes the question easier. Number 3 is that just to be aware, questions have different styles in Part B. So some of the questions, you'll have one main phrase that's really the key phrase pointing to the answer. However, with other questions, you might have multiple phrases or several key words or ideas that you're using all together to get to the answer. So just be aware that there are different styles, and sometimes if you're trying to just find one main phrase, that may not be exactly what the question is asking for. Finally, and most importantly, don't forget that the OET is a language test. So that should guide us in what we're looking for with our questions. For example, being able to recognize things like the language of obligations and requirements. So in English, what sort of words go with those kind of things? For example, warnings and consequences. Often in the OET, it's not as obvious as, I am warning you about this, or it will be a terrible consequence if you do this. It's not as explicit as that in the text. It's more subtle. So there's language that is pointing to a warning or pointing to a consequence, but not a direct obvious wording, and that can lead to a lot of struggle if you're not able to match what is there to what the question is asking. Finally, common technique is recognizing how the text will have examples, so specific details often, that actually match the category or label given in the question. So being able to pair those two together is a bit of a language challenge of seeing how the details fit the overall label or category. So there's 4 pieces of advice. Let's go into now a time of practice with some questions. And to start, I have 3 questions for you. Now, you can pause the video, you can do the reading yourself, you can try to choose the best answer and then listen to my explanation, or if you're just starting out, follow along with me as I work through these, and eventually you'll get faster and faster to a place you can do them on your own. So here's our first question. You'll notice that each question in text or in section B has its own text. So this is the text just for question 1 there. You'll notice it's a memo. So we often see memos, emails, updates, we see workplace documents and policies. And we have, again, a bit of information here, all staff, and then the subject bare below the elbow policy. Now, some people like to go right to the question and read what they're asking for here. So what is the memo doing? Is it reminding? Is it issuing or presenting? So that's where our verb choice comes in. A, reminding staff of their obligations. I like to highlight some of the key words so my mind is guided towards what sort of language I'm looking for. Issuing a warning to non-compliant staff, or presenting new guidelines for staff to follow. So here's a tip as well. Often our questions in both section B and part C, often you'll see aspects of each of the options in the text. And that's where going back to the verb and exactly what the question is asking is so important, because you might see components of each one, but only one of them fully captures what the question is asking. So I'm going to just briefly read this for us. You can either follow along and read or just listen as I'm doing this. So, hand hygiene remains the single most effective means of preventing the transmission of healthcare associated infections. The hospital ensures that the bare below the elbow policy is clearly defined and is widely available to all staff at all levels and in all disciplines. Staff must make effective hand hygiene possible by ensuring full compliance with the bare below the elbow policy. Uniforms and workwear must not impede effective hand hygiene and should not come into contact with patients during direct patient care activity. All staffs must adopt the policy whenever they are engaged in a direct patient care activity. Okay, so as you're doing the exam, you'll probably have to read faster than that, but for our purposes, that covers it. So first thing to check for as you're reading, I would say look at the way the information is presented. So is it direct statements? Are there commands? Is it suggestions? And take a look at, and what you'll notice right away is we have a lot of they must do this, it must not impede, they must adopt. So there's a lot of repetition with some of that vocabulary. Now, reminding, when you see the word reminding staff of their obligations, the key thing to note is the staff should already know something, and that will help us rule out whether it is A, B, or C, and especially the contrast between A and C. So presenting new guidelines versus reminding staff of their obligations. Well, here's a piece of negative evidence in here. We see here that the policy is clearly defined and it is widely available. So C is therefore not correct, because it's not that they're introducing something new, they're actually, everything is already established. So that's a piece of negative evidence to eliminate that. Now, let's go back between A and B. So this is tricky here. We have reminding staff of their obligations, issuing a warning to non-compliant staff. And I'll just change the color here. This is a common thing that happens with part B, is you'll have an option where part of it might be true, but part of it may not be true in the option. So if we look here, issuing a warning to non-compliant staff, when we see here, they're referencing staff and all staff, but we really don't have anything specific to those not compliant. All we're getting is instructions for what they should do or they must do. So that's something to pay careful attention to. Is it applying to everyone? Are they addressing this certain group of people and whatnot? So based on that, B is also not a good fit for what the question is asking. But that's not enough. We should confirm as well that there is evidence here to support A. Reminding staff of their obligations. So let me ask you a language question. If you're going to tell me obligations, what sort of language would you use? Well, hopefully you'd be using things like modals, right? You must do this. It's important to do this. You should do this. And if you look at this, they must make effective hand hygiene possible. It must not impede effective hand hygiene and so forth. What else do we have here? They must adopt the policy whenever they're engaged in a direct patient care activity. So it's not new information. They're just being emphasized, or in this case, reminded of those things. So great example of how you as a person taking the test needs to recognize the language piece here behind the word obligations. So big clue is, again, repeated modals, in this case, pointing to that. All right, let's go on there to number 2. So a totally new text here. It's a staff notice confirming a patient's blood group prior to transfusion. So pause the video for a second. I'm not going to read this one out. I want you to read through it. Choose option A, B, or C, looking for both positive and negative evidence. Then when you're ready, unpause it and I will go through this in detail. Okay, assuming you've paused it and you're ready for the answer. So the notice warns staff not to. So a couple keywords. Warnings, we've seen to be aware of warnings and consequences. Not to. So we're thinking of the things that they shouldn't do. Now, our options: rely on information held on record without checking its accuracy, order blood products before submitting the necessary samples. I should highlight that too. Collect both of the required blood samples at the same time. Okay, so when you're looking in your text, what are you trying to focus on? Well, okay, is there any information that rules out these options? And let's take a look even at this opening section here. What does it say? It require that prior to issue of blood or blood products, at least 2 samples have been received in order to confirm the patient's blood group. Okay, so the wording of B is interesting. Order blood products before submitting the necessary samples. So we have to sort of flip it in our minds here. So they're saying prior to the issue of blood products, at least 2 samples have been received. So it's not an issue so much with the ordering of the blood products, but the actual giving of the blood products. They need the samples before that. So just like we saw in that first one, make sure with your options that you're reading that all the words actually meet the criteria of what the text is saying. So it should be, they shouldn't issue blood products before submitting the necessary samples. So we can rule out B from that. Now, how about A or C? So let's go to the next sentence. Many patients already have historical groups on the local information management system, and only one further sample is therefore required. And then they go into when there's no historical group is available. So rely on information held on record without checking its accuracy. So they do talk about records like the local information management system that is referenced here, but there isn't any instructions about the fact that they should or shouldn't check it. It's just saying, again, they have that there. So while logically that might be something they shouldn't do, this is where checking what the text actually says and doesn't say is important. So in here, it's really just telling us, again, that there is information for some patients on file, and therefore only one further sample is required. So there's not enough evidence that is a direct warning there. So based on the negative evidence alone, I can conclude that the answer is C, but now comes the important part. Let's go find confirming evidence to support that. So the notice warns staff not to collect both of the required blood samples at the same time. So if I'm looking through here, they talk about this idea of having the patient being fully identified on each occasion. The hospital does not currently recommend a set period of time between collection of these samples. Okay, where it is suspected that the samples have been collected simultaneously or at the same time, that's interesting. For example, where the date of collection is the same on both, they will be treated as one sample and one will be discarded. Okay, so here's what's really interesting. There is nowhere in this text that gives us explicit warnings or consequences, but look at the language here. Look at the if this happens, then that happens. So this kind of language structure, where it is suspected that the samples have been collected, or the condition clause, and then we have a definitive future tense, will be treated as one sample. And again, what is it testing? It's testing your ability to recognize the subtle language structure of a warning. So yes, it's not a threatening, dangerous, the language is not dramatic, but it is actually accurate in how it's presenting the condition and then the results that will happen. So what is it doing? It's saying these are the consequences. If the blood samples are collected at the same time. So I hope you see that. And this comes up a lot where we have a more subtle structure behind the question. And as soon as you start recognizing that, it makes finding the answer so much easier because you're looking at not the content so much, but you're looking at the language and how it's expressed. Okay, so try one more with me here. I'll go to number 3. In this one, we have County Pathology Laboratory User Guide. So sometimes we will have manual and guide questions. And in this case, same thing. Pause the video, read through the text, read the question, select an answer. When you're ready for working through this with me, unpause the video. Okay, assuming you've done all the previous steps. The instructions for sending materials to the laboratory emphasize the importance of. Okay. Emphasize, a new verb for us here that we haven't seen up till this point. So emphasize, what sort of things? Well, we look for language that places a strength on it, but emphasis can also be repetition of something. If I tell you it once and then I tell you it again in a different way a third time, repeated details and examples that can also indicate that it's being emphasized. So here's something interesting with this one. The whole, like all the options here are about this package, right? Because the text is talking about this package and sorting through the difference between the options is a bit challenging. So again, A is clearly identifying the contents of any packages. So keyword is the identification here. B is ensuring that materials cannot leak from the packages. C, storing packages of samples in an appropriate place. So is it identification, ensuring they're not going to leak, or storing in an appropriate place? So let's go through this and look at some of the language clues. So first of all, let's see identifying the contents. Let's see if there's any evidence in here for A there. We do have, so at the very end, there is, laboratory should be placed in a transparent transport box to allow examination prior to opening. Okay, whether that's actual like identification of it is unclear. So it's a bit vague. Again, emphasizing we're thinking it's really repeated throughout or strongly indicated. Ensuring the materials cannot leak from the packages. So right off the start, we have that word containment. So they must be packaged to a high standard of containment and in such a way as to contain the contents in the event of a breakage if they are roughly handled or dropped. They should be treated with care. Okay, so lots of like language about the actual container itself, treated with care. Still not clear if we're talking about preventing leaking or the storing of the packages themselves. So let's keep reading. Look at this. Samples should be transported in a suitable transport container designed for the purpose with sufficient absorbent material to absorb the entire liquid content. Okay. This should be placed in a Ziploc bag. The request form should be placed in a separate pouch. So here's something interesting. We have to kind of take the examples given and make a bit of a conclusion from it. So the evidence is there, but we have to ask ourselves a question. Is this, like, to what purpose are they giving this information? So why store it in a Ziploc bag? Or why store it in a suitable container? And we see the parts about, like, in the event of a breakage, or this idea of absorbing the entire liquid content. Those phrases, they correspond with this word leaking from the package. So yes, it's not directly said it's going to leak, but both of those pieces point to the concern about the fact that it could, again, break, not be handled well, or the liquid content spill as well. Now for C, let's see, storing packages of samples in an appropriate place. So we do have that they should be taken by hand to the laboratory, should be placed in a transparent box. We don't actually have a location, like where in the laboratory, top shelf, bottom shelf, where. So we do have an appropriate way to store them in the Ziploc bag, in the transparent box, but not actually a location. So that's a good example again of how part of the criteria of C rules that out as an option. If it's in an appropriate way, that would be fine, or appropriate method. And we've ruled out A as well earlier. So that narrows us down to B. Now, when we're thinking of back to the question, words of emphasis, this kind of example is really just, they're not saying you should do this, it's so important to do this, you have to do this. The emphasis is coming from multiple examples. So they're saying, again, suitable container, transporting it, placing it in a Ziploc bag, taking even by hand as well, the lid securely sealed, again, with that idea of preventing leakage. So notice here that you have to keep a bit of an open mind with the word emphasis. It's not always one form. There's that repetition piece we've seen. There's also that strong language can also be used in other sort of questions. But hopefully you see across questions 1, 2, and 3 how each of these questions gets at a slightly different aspect of language. And in our next video, we're going to continue with questions 4, 5, and 6. And we'll see again how reading that question carefully, looking at the verb, and then eliminating options, all these strategies come into play to find that correct answer. Comment down below. Let me know, how did you do on questions 1 through 3? Is there anything that needs clarifying in my explanation? And if so, I'll comment down below in response to that. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to my channel so you're notified for those next videos for part 2 of part B.